Returning home from work, a homeowner in San Manuel, Arizona was surely surprised to find something unexpected. Instead of finding their dog curled up in its usual spot, they were shocked to see a wild bobcat lounging comfortably in the fluffy dog bed. The animal had likely entered the house through an unlocked doggy door and decided to make itself at home while the owners were away. The young bobcat was thin, limping, and seemed desperate. By the time officers from the Arizona Game and Fish Department arrived, the bobcat had already managed to escape. Thankfully, neither the dog nor any humans were harmed. But that was only the beginning. What happened next left everyone speechless. Before we start, hit the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories. The August heat in San Manuel, Arizona was particularly brutal that year. Margaret Thompson stood at her kitchen window, watching the thermometer on the porch climb past 108 degrees. At 72, she'd lived in this small mining town long enough to know the rhythms of the desert. But something felt different this summer. The wildlife seemed more desperate, more willing to venture closer to human habitation. "Tom," she called to her husband, who was tinkering with the air conditioning unit in the living room. "We need to leave more water out for the animals. I saw 3 javelinas yesterday morning, and they looked terrible." Tom Thompson, a retired copper mine supervisor, grunted his agreement. At 75, his knees complained more than they used to, but his heart for animals remained as soft as the day Margaret had met him 50 years ago. Their golden retriever, Duke, lifted his graying muzzle from his oversized fluffy bed near the sliding door, his tail giving a half-hearted wag at the mention of other animals. "I'll fill the big basin before we head to the doctor's office," Tom promised, checking his watch. Margaret's cardiology appointment was at 2, and they'd likely be gone most of the afternoon. As they prepared to leave, Margaret paused at the sliding door. The doggy door they'd installed for Duke 5 years ago still worked perfectly, though Duke used it less frequently now that arthritis had settled into his hips. She thought about locking it. There'd been reports of wildlife entering homes through pet doors, but Duke liked to go in and out during the day, and they'd never had any problems. "Ready?" Tom asked, jangling the car keys. Margaret nodded, giving Duke a gentle pat. "Be good, boy. We'll be back before dinner." The house fell silent except for the hum of the air conditioning and Duke's gentle snoring. Outside, the desert shimmered with heat waves, and the shadows grew shorter as noon approached. It was then that she appeared, a shadow moving through the ironwood trees at the property's edge. The bobcat was young, perhaps 2 years old, her coat dusty and marked with the distinctive spots that helped her blend into the desert landscape. But something was wrong. Her left hind leg bore the marks of an old injury, likely from a territorial dispute or a close call with a coyote. The wound had healed, but it had left her with a slight limp that made hunting more difficult. In the harsh economics of desert survival, even a small disadvantage could mean the difference between life and death. She'd been watching this house for weeks. The water Tom faithfully put out had drawn her attention first, but she'd noticed other things too. The gentle old dog who moved slowly and didn't bark at shadows, the quiet routine of the elderly couple, the cool air that escaped from the doggy door whenever it flapped open. Desperation and exhaustion finally overcame caution. The bobcat approached the house, her padded feet silent on the hot gravel. She paused at the doggy door, her keen senses analyzing every scent and sound. Duke's smell was everywhere, but it wasn't aggressive or threatening, just old and tired, like the mesquite trees that dotted the landscape. She pushed through. The cool air hit her like a blessing. The tiled floor felt like ice against her overheated paw pads. She stood still for a long moment, every muscle tensed for flight, her golden eyes scanning the interior. The house was quiet, safe. Duke lifted his head when she entered, their eyes meeting across the living room. In another life, in another circumstance, there might have been confrontation. But Duke was old and wise, and the Bobcat was young and desperate. They regarded each other with the careful respect of creatures who understood survival. The Bobcat's gaze fell on Duke's bed, an enormous, fluffy thing that Margaret had bought online, laughing at its ridiculous size even for their 70-pound retriever. It was positioned perfectly in the cool airflow, soft and inviting. Duke watched as she approached it, his tail giving a single, uncertain wag. She circled the bed twice, her instincts warring with exhaustion. Finally, she stepped onto it, her claws catching slightly in the plush fabric. It was softer than anything she'd ever experienced. Softer than the sandy washes where she usually rested. Softer than the beds of dried grass she sometimes found. She turned in a circle, once, twice, then settled down with a deep sigh that seemed to come from her very soul. Duke laid his head back down and closed his eyes. If this strange, spotted visitor wanted to share his space, who was he to object? He'd shared his home with cats before, though never one quite this large. The Bobcat dozed fitfully, one ear always swiveling toward sounds, ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. But as the minutes passed and nothing threatened, her body began to truly relax for the first time in weeks. The cool air, the soft bed, the quiet safety of the house. It was a paradise she hadn't known existed. When Margaret and Tom returned home 3 hours later, the sight that greeted them would become etched in their memories forever. Tom saw her first, his hand freezing on Margaret's arm as they entered through the garage. "Margie," he whispered, his voice tight with disbelief. "Don't move." There, in Duke's bed, surrounded by his toys and blankets, lay a wild bobcat. She was curled into a tight ball, her spotted coat rising and falling with peaceful breaths. Duke sat nearby, tail wagging as his humans returned, seemingly unbothered by his exotic houseguest. Margaret's hand went to her mouth. In all their years in Arizona, they'd seen bobcats from a distance, fleeting glimpses of wild beauty. But this was impossible. "My phone," Margaret whispered. "It's in my purse." Moving with the careful deliberation of people who'd lived long enough to know when to be cautious, she retrieved her phone and managed to capture several photos. The bobcat's ear twitched at the soft click of the camera, but she didn't wake. "We need to call Game and Fish," Tom said quietly. This can't be normal." Margaret nodded, already pulling up the number. The conversation with the dispatcher was surreal. No, they weren't joking. Yes, there was actually a bobcat in their dog's bed. No, no one was hurt. Yes, they were sure it was a bobcat and not a large house cat. Officer James Rodriguez arrived within 40 minutes, though it felt like hours as Margaret and Tom stood frozen in their kitchen, watching the sleeping predator. Rodriguez, a 20-year veteran of Arizona Game and Fish, had seen a lot in his career, but even he paused when he saw the scene. "Well," he said softly, "that's a first." He began explaining the protocols, how they'd need to carefully encourage the animal to leave, the dangers of wildlife in homes, the diseases they could carry. But even as he spoke, something shifted in the living room. The bobcat's eyes opened, immediately alert. She saw the humans, saw the additional person in uniform, and her body tensed. But she didn't panic. With a fluid grace that seemed impossible for a creature that had been dead asleep moments before, she rose, stretched, actually stretched like a house cat, and padded toward the doggy door. She paused at the threshold, looking back once with those distinctive tufted ears perked forward, then slipped out into the fading afternoon light. "I'll be damned," Rodriguez muttered. Then, remembering himself, he launched into a lecture about securing pet doors and the dangers of wildlife interaction. Margaret and Tom nodded along, but their minds were elsewhere, replaying the surreal encounter. That night, as they lay in bed, neither could sleep. "Tom," Margaret said into the darkness, "did you see how thin she was?" "I saw. And her leg. She was limping." "I know." They lay quiet for a moment before Margaret spoke again. Duke didn't mind her. Tom sighed. He knew where this was going. After 50 years of marriage, he could read his wife's thoughts as clearly as if they were written in the stars visible through their bedroom window. "Margie," Rodriguez said. "I know what he said. But Tom, she didn't hurt anything. She just wanted to rest somewhere cool and safe. When was the last time we saw the creek running? When was the last real rain?" Tom didn't answer because they both knew. The drought had been severe, even by Arizona standards. Wildlife was struggling across the region. The next morning, Margaret found Tom in the garage, pulling out an old dog bed they'd kept from Duke's younger days. "What are you doing?" she asked, though she already knew. "Nothing stupid," Tom replied, his weathered hands working to fluff up the old cushion. "Just thought maybe we could put this on the covered porch, near the door but not inside. If she comes back, and I'm not saying she will, but if she does, she'd have somewhere to rest that's not in the house." Margaret smiled and kissed his stubbled cheek. "I'll get some water bowls." They set up what they'd later jokingly call the Bobcat Motel, the bed positioned where it would catch the breeze but remain in shade. Fresh water in a heavy ceramic bowl that couldn't be easily tipped, all of it visible from their kitchen window but far enough from the door to feel safe. 2 days passed with no sign of her. Tom began to wonder if they were foolish. 2 lonely retirees anthropomorphizing a wild animal. But on the 3rd morning, as dawn painted the mountains pink and gold, Margaret grabbed his arm as they stood at the kitchen window with their coffee. The bobcat was there, circling the bed with obvious suspicion. She sniffed every inch of it, checked the sight lines to ensure she had escape routes, tested the surface with one paw. Then, as if making a monumental decision, she settled onto it, her body relaxing by degrees. "Don't get attached," Tom warned, but his voice was gentle, and Margaret saw him reach for the binoculars they kept on the windowsill. Over the following weeks, a routine developed. The bobcat, whom Margaret secretly named Grace, though she never said it aloud, would appear every few days. Sometimes she'd rest for hours, other times just long enough to drink water and cool down. Duke would watch from inside, his tail wagging whenever she appeared, and she seemed to accept his presence with equal equanimity. Margaret researched everything she could about bobcats. She learned about their territorial nature, their usual fear of humans, their dietary needs. She joined online forums where wildlife rehabilitators shared knowledge, always careful to phrase her questions hypothetically. Tom installed a motion-activated camera to monitor the porch, and they'd spend evenings reviewing footage like proud grandparents watching home movies. As September rolled into October and the heat finally began to break, Grace's visits became more regular. She was filling out, her coat becoming glossier. The limp was still there but seemed less pronounced. Sometimes, in the early morning or late evening, they'd see her playing with a stick or batting at insects, behaviors that made her seem impossibly young and vulnerable despite her wild nature. The first time Grace and Duke made physical contact, Margaret nearly dropped her coffee mug. It was a cool November morning, and Tom had left the sliding door open to let in the fresh air. Duke was lying on the threshold, half in and half out, when Grace appeared. Instead of settling on her porch bed, she approached Duke directly. They touched noses, a brief, delicate contact, before Grace moved past him into the house. "Tom," Margaret breathed. But Tom was already there, watching as Grace padded to Duke's indoor bed and settled down as if she'd never left. "What do we do?" Margaret whispered. "Nothing," Tom replied after a moment. "We do nothing. She knows the way out." That day marked a change. Grace began coming inside more frequently, though never when they were moving around. She seemed to understand the house's rhythms. Early morning when they had coffee, late evening when they watched the news. She and Duke developed an odd friendship, sometimes sharing the bed, sometimes lying near each other in companionable silence. Officer Rodriguez would have been horrified, but Margaret and Tom told no one. This was their secret, their small miracle in the desert. January brought unusual cold, and Grace's visits became daily. She was definitely gaining weight, her belly rounding in a way that made Margaret and Tom exchange knowing looks. They'd seen enough nature documentaries to recognize the signs. "She's pregnant," Margaret said one evening as they watched Grace groom herself on Duke's bed. Tom nodded. "What do we do? What can we do? We can't put her out in the cold." They waited and watched, nervous as expectant grandparents. Grace seemed to sense their concern, becoming more skittish as her pregnancy advanced. But she still came, drawn by the safety and warmth they offered. It happened on a cold February night. They woke to soft mewing sounds coming from the living room. Creeping to the doorway, they peeked around the corner to find Grace in the throes of labor. Duke sat nearby like a sentinel, alert but calm. Over the next 2 hours, they watched in silent awe as Grace delivered 3 tiny kittens. She was magnificent, efficient, instinctual, fierce in her devotion. The kittens were impossibly small, blind and mewing, their spotted coats still damp. Margaret gripped Tom's hand so tightly he'd later joke about bruises. They backed away, giving Grace space, but the camera captured everything. For 3 weeks, Grace raised her kittens in their living room. They adjusted their entire lives around her schedule, tiptoeing through their own home, communicating in whispers and gestures. Duke appointed himself guardian, lying between the family and any visitors who came to the door, which Margaret and Tom discouraged with various excuses. They watched the kittens grow, their eyes opening, their first wobbling steps, their play fights that Duke observed with paternal patience. Grace was an exceptional mother, fierce, attentive, teaching them with gentle swats and purrs that rumbled like a small motor. Then one morning, they were gone. The bed was empty, the house quiet. Margaret cried, and Tom held her, neither ashamed of their attachment to the wild family that had graced their home. "She did what she had to do," Tom said softly. "She needs to teach them to be wild." They saw Grace occasionally over the next months, a shadow at the tree line, a glimpse on the camera. She never came to the bed, never approached the house. It was as if she understood that chapter had closed. Duke seemed to miss her most of all. He'd lie on his bed and sigh, his brown eyes scanning the yard hopefully. Margaret bought him new toys. Tom took him for slow walks despite his own creaking joints. But Duke's vigor continued to fade as summer returned. On a blazing July afternoon, almost a year after Grace had first appeared, Duke passed quietly in his sleep, his head resting on the bed where he'd first shared space with a wild bobcat. Margaret and Tom buried him beneath the Palo Verde tree in the backyard, both crying unashamedly for their gentle companion who had bridged the gap between wild and domestic with such grace. That evening, as they sat on the porch in the cooling air, movement at the yard's edge caught their attention. Grace emerged from the shadows, but she wasn't alone. 3 young bobcats followed her. Lean, healthy, their coats marked with distinctive spots. Her kittens, now nearly grown. The family of bobcats stood at the edge of the yard, 4 pairs of golden eyes reflecting the porch light. Grace looked directly at Margaret and Tom, holding their gaze for a long moment. Then, with a dignity that took their breath away, she turned and led her children back into the desert. "She came to say goodbye," Margaret whispered, tears streaming down her face. Tom pulled her close. "Or thank you." They never saw Grace again, though they kept the bed on the porch and fresh water available always. Sometimes on quiet mornings, they'd find paw prints in the dust, evidence that the desert's children still pass through. They'd gotten a new dog, a rescued shepherd mix named Molly, but they'd also had a new doggy door installed, one with a lock they faithfully secured each night. The story of the bobcat who'd chosen their home for sanctuary became legend in their small circle of friends, told and retold with increasing embellishment. But Margaret and Tom kept the deepest truth to themselves, that for one brief magical period, the boundary between human and wild had dissolved, replaced by something rarer and more precious: mutual trust, respect, and a love that transcended species. In the end, that's what the desert had taught them after all these years. That kindness, offered freely and without expectation, creates ripples that extend far beyond what we can see. Grace and her kittens were out there somewhere, living their wild lives, carrying within them the memory of a cool floor, a soft bed, and 2 old humans who'd offered sanctuary when it was needed most. And in the Thompson house, where Duke's collar still hung by the door and a spare bed still waited on the porch, that memory lived on too. A reminder that sometimes the most profound connections come from the most unexpected places, padding silently into our lives on spotted paws, asking for nothing more than a moment of rest in a weary world.